Hey guys, it's me. Now, first we're going to start talking about the geography of China. One of the main features of the geography of China is the Himalayan mountains. The Himalayan mountains is located to the southern part of China. Now, right behind the Himalayas is the Tibetan Plateau. Behind the Tibetan Plateau, you have the Gobi Desert. Along the coast, the two main rivers we talked about was the Yellow River, which is also known as the River of Sorrow. It's called the Yellow River because the silt from the Gobi Desert blows into it, giving us a yellow tint. And you can guess why it's called the River of Sorrow. We also talked about the Yangtze River. Both the Yangtze River and the Yellow River flood unpredictably. Basically, they don't know when they're coming. They both flood extremely violently. Geographically speaking, China is most similar to Egypt in its isolation. One of the primary factors in this isolation is the distance from other civilizations. It was just so far to travel to China that in and of itself isolated, not even taking into account the Himalaya mountains, the Gobi deserts, and all the geographical features that did end up isolating them from the rest of the world. They were so isolated that they considered themselves the Middle Kingdom, which they considered themselves the Middle Kingdom because everybody came to them. And this isolation gave them a sense of uniqueness as well as a sense of distrust of foreigners. Now we're going to talk about some of the architectural features of China. The first we're going to talk about is the terracotta soldiers. The terracotta soldiers were created for the Emperor Qin Shi Huang. You can spell that Qin, pronounced Shin. And the terracotta soldiers was meant to go with the emperor into the afterlife to give him the same power that he had during life. Each terracotta soldier has a different face, a different body style. Originally, you see how their hands are holding out like that. They were holding weapons, and they were painted very vibrant colors. It's remarkable how the terracotta soldiers were found. They were found by a farmer who found them in quite a mess. They were all broken up. He reported it to the Chinese government. The Chinese government then created this huge archaeological site. It's rumored that the site is even bigger, but they're still excavating, trying to find all of this tomb for Emperor Qin. The other architectural feature we're going to discuss is the Great Wall of China. Now, it's not so much the building of the Great Wall, how the Great Wall was built we're most interested in, but what is it effective is what we're most interested in. And for that, I'm going to refer you back to the assignment. And you're going to be expected to explain, was it effective or was it not? There are arguments for both. You're going to have to support your evidence either way. And we talked about that extensively in class. And finally, when we talk about Chinese architecture, make sure you take and consider the difference in the roof styles. You remember we talked about the roofs and we saw those pictures, how they're angled? And you can even see some of that in the Great Wall of China. If you take a look at the picture, you can see how the roofs are angles, whereas we saw the roofs in Egypt and roofs in Mesopotamia were flat. Remember, the difference is that they got more rain in China. They had the monsoon season. And so they were angled like that to get the rain off the roof. Now let's talk about a little agriculture. One of the predominant features you'll see in the mountains of China for their agricultural system is terrace farming. As you can see in the picture, terrace farming allowed for more farmland to be created by flattening land around the mountain. Usually these areas were filled with water and rice was planted. Rice was their predominant crop, even though they did also grow other things such as wheat, barley, and other cereal crops. They also had two primary inventions that came from China. One being the water wheel, which helped irrigate farms, which we talked about before. The other being the seed drill, which helped plant seeds quicker. They would walk behind the seed drill and step on the seeds as it fell off the back. And the final being the iron plow. All were shipped out of China via the Silk Road and were adopted by other civilizations and helped to improve basically agriculture around the world. All right, let's talk about politics now. And we talk Chinese politics, we have to start with the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven is simply that a dynasty or a ruler has the approval of heaven to rule. The Chao dynasty is the first one that came up with this concept. And it was the Chao, after they defeated an earlier dynasty that had to justify their power. And this is sort of how they did it. That the mandate of heaven is most similar to the concept of Ma'at and Isfat that we saw in Egypt. It's really not that similar to divine right, because if you think about the term divine right, it's saying you have a right to rule. Mandate of heaven is saying that you need the approval of heaven to rule. So they're a little bit opposite in that category. The mandate of heaven is part of the dynastic cycle. The dynastic cycle is basically the pattern in the pattern of rise and falls of dynasties in China, and it's a clear, distinct pattern. It starts off with a new dynasty that's strong, everything's going great. The dynasty gets old, taxes go up, corruption increase, rulers start to not be as good. From there, we move to you may have a natural disaster, and from there we go from natural disasters to usually an invasion or revolt. The dynasty is overthrown, and the cycle starts again. And so when you're thinking about the dynastic cycle, you got to start thinking about, how do you know when you have the approval or do not have the approval of heaven? How do you know if a dynasty has lost the mandate of heaven? And as the primary sources that we read in class several times stated, that you have to look at the actions of the ruler and the deeds and basically everything about the kingdom. And when you see such things as natural disasters, if you see disorder, if you see revolts or rebellions, what you're looking at then is that the ruler has lost the mandate of heaven. To the opposite of that, a ruler or a dynasty has the mandate of heaven if the dynasty's in order, if taxes are low, people are happy, things are running well. And even if they can be natural disasters, as one of our primary sources told us, but if the emperor's on top of it and take care of it quick, as the Confucius scholar told us, then it won't be a problem. Okay? And so keep that in mind and make sure you reread those primary resources that we talked about in class. Now, there's 3 different governmental philosophies we discussed. And these philosophies are also considered by many in China to be a religion. The primary religion in China for years was like oracle bones and ancestor worship, and basically an overall nature type worship. The oracle bones were used to, communicate with their primary spirit entity, which was called a Dai Di. And also with their ancestors. They believed their ancestor could play an active role in their lives. They wanted to know the ancestors' will. They would use the oracle bones to determine that. Gradually, Chinese religion evolved, and their view of religion has always been a little bit different from the Western view. And a lot of times they consider things that we would consider philosophy. A philosophy is a way of thinking. But they had 3 other philosophies that we have talked about that are essentially political philosophies that are also maybe considered religions. The first is Confucianism. Confucianism basically considers all people are good, that leaders should be lead by example, that there really is not need for strict laws because, as one of our sources told us, that if a leader sets a good example, others will follow. They also have the 5 relationships, father to son, older brother to younger brother, husband to wife, and ruler to subject and friend to friend. Remember, Confucius also emphasized the need for respect for parents. He called his field piety, Filial, piety, Piety. He believed that respect for the ruler, and for society as whole began with the family unit. They had another philosophy called legalism. There was only really one emperor that followed legalism. That was Emperor Shen, the same one who built the the soldiers and the huge tomb. But legalism emphasized that people were evil and that basically bad, and they needed laws to keep them enforced and keep people in order. And then you have Taoism, which is also known as Laoism, which is also known as Taoism. And basically, this is just believes that government as a whole really shouldn't interfere with people. They should let people be people and be natural, and they consider government to be unnatural, which begs to a question: what would a government ran by a Laoist or a Taoist or a Taoist philosophy or philosopher? What would a government look like under that? Good question there. These philosophies are essential to Chinese government. Most Chinese emperors, fell with Confucianism and the relationship on being a model leader. Confucius, one of his predominant beliefs was that what set people apart was their education, and based on this, the Chinese created something called the civil service system, which is basically the government bureaucracy. But to be a part of the government bureaucracy, you weren't born into it, you had to test into it. And anybody could take this test, which allowed for some social mobility. Remember that story we read in class the other day? Recall that, and it shows you that there was some social mobility created by the civil service system. But also remember, it cost a lot to take this exam, so not many people could actually get into the Chinese civil service, but it did offer some social mobility. And remember, the Chinese civil service system was based on Confucian principles that education is what sets people apart and what makes you a valued member of Chinese society, because it was education, according to Confucius, that made people who they are. And you remember the ranking that he had. He said the smartest people were those that are the best people to govern. The best people were those who were born smart. The second best, those who had to study to be smart. And the third level of person would be those who never had the opportunity to study and to increase their knowledge. And this is what Confucius believed. And he literally broke people up into classes based on their knowledge, and the government, basically, the Chinese government, followed with that. And let's talk a little about Chinese economics. You can't talk about Chinese economics without talking about the Silk Road. First, the Silk Road is not just a single road, it is a series of roads. It also included several sea trading routes, mainly in the Mediterranean Sea, but also some in the Indian Ocean. The Silk Road is, remember how we talked about, is very comparable to the modern day internet. And you're needing to look over those notes, because we had a very detailed discussion in class actually today about that. The Silk Road was the primary money maker for the Chinese government, and it came from the trade of silk, but not just silk, but other things as well. As agricultural products were traded, and as well as knowledge. And in some cases, religion moved along the Silk Road. So once again, I'm going to refer you back to your notes and to the discussion we had about how similar the Silk Road is to the internet. Now, the basic economy of China was basically, it was agriculturally based, predominantly on the growth of rice. Silk was the big money maker. Silk Road and the Silk Route was the big income maker. The Chinese at one point used a type of shell for money, but they also had the first form of printed money. Various things were traded along the Silk Road, and it was these things that, such as everything from agricultural products to glass to jade, a very valuable type of stone, pearls. And remember, the Chinese really didn't want many manufactured goods because their goods were good enough. What they wanted in exchange for their silk predominantly was gold and silver, as well as other valuable minerals like jade, like pearls, like even types of glass in exchange for their silk. And the China's reliance on their own products and refusal to buy things manufactured in other countries was a big problem for the rest of the world, particularly Europe, for many centuries, until they finally found a way to break into the Chinese market much later in time. But as far as Chinese economics go, all you need to know is A, the importance of the Silk Road. It was predominantly money maker. The Chinese did not want any goods manufactured out of China. They only wanted valuable commodities such as pearls, gold, silver, jade, and other things. And third, it was agriculture that was at the base of their economy, the growth of rice that allowed them to produce excess agricultural products that allowed them to trade even more. The last subject we're going to be talking about is the Chinese social structure. And, the Chinese social structure is like any other. On top, you have the emperor, and below it, you had the nobility. Some were called governors, some were called kings, but they were all below the emperor. You had the state officials, the nobles, and the scholars that on that third level, and they're the group that had to take the civil service exam. And so notice it said state officials. They were the people who had to take the civil service exam. Scholars were also the people who had to take the exam. They were on the same level as nobles. Now, right below the nobles, you see the peasants. Below the peasants, the artisans and merchants. And below them, soldiers. And then below them, slaves. Now, let's talk a little bit about why peasants. This is the first time we've seen peasants above artisans and merchants. And the reasons for this is the way Chinese view what China values, what Chinese society values. Chinese society values work, and it values what a person contributes to society. We saw this actually, if you remember, when we talked about Buddhism and how they had a problem with Buddhism because it interfered with what the peasant was given to government, what the peasant was given to society. And so since the Chinese placed a large, a lot of faith and a lot of value in what you give to society, it bumped the peasants up on the social scale. And if you think about it, the peasants contribute a lot. They contribute food, they contribute labor for the army, but most importantly, they contribute food. And the emperor recognized that it was this agricultural base that was so important to Chinese society, and it actually raised them up on the social scale. And if you take a look at artisans and merchants, they produce things basically to sell for themselves. A pot, doesn't quite benefit society the way that food does. And so they were lowered down a bit. And they were even higher than soldiers. And you're asking yourself, why soldiers on the bottom? If you think about it, soldiers do not contribute food to their system. It does not contribute much to their system. It contributes defense. But if you take a soldier who is a peasant from the field, there's one less person now there to produce food. And since there's one less person to produce food, that's less that Chinese society is going to have as a whole. So they view soldiers actually as kind of low on the totem pole. And on the very bottom, you see slaves. And they had slaves in China, but you got to realize slavery really wasn't big in China, simply for the fact that they had such an abundance of labor. And when labor was so cheap, slavery really never grew to the prominence that it grew into the Greek Empire, into the Roman Empire, or in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Okay, guys, good luck on your tests. Y'all take care, and bye-bye.